We are recording the interview of Air Force veteran Dianne Hickey. This interview is being conducted by Jeremy Tack and Eric Rude from the Wright State University's Veteran Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 12:15 on December 1st, 2017. Dianne, thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. Dianne is actually a special guest today because she is my former commander in the 14th Intelligence Squadron, so I'm very happy that you're here.
Thanks for asking.
So let's start off with where and when were you born?
So I was born in Medina, Ohio, just south of Cleveland in 1973, and I grew up in Medina County in a small farm town until I joined the Air Force right out of high school in 1991.
All right. Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
My dad is James Spencer, and he had a career in road construction and became a foreman, worked a lot of the interstate work up in the Cleveland area. My mom worked a lot of different jobs over the years, 2 jobs sometimes, whether it was in retail or childcare, so just a lot of blue-collar work in the family.
Do you have any siblings?
I do. I have 7 siblings, 2 brothers, and do the math, 5 sisters.
Is there anyone else in your family that was in the military?
There was. I didn't know it when I joined the military, but afterwards I got to talking. I have an uncle that was in the Army. He was drafted in Vietnam, and then my mother had a couple uncles that were in World War II.
So what were you doing before you joined the Air Force?
I was in high school, and it was 1990, 1991, so I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. I wasn't feeling college so much, and then we had Desert Shield, Desert Storm, and I thought I want to be part of that. Whatever that is, I want to be a part of that because it was pretty amazing to see the United States go in and defend Kuwait. And so I decided I'm joining the military, and I went to the Navy recruiter, talked to the Navy recruiter a couple times. I thought their uniforms were nicer than the Air Force uniforms. So I was leaning that way, but then when I made up my mind I'm going to do this, the Navy guy wasn't there and the Air Force guy was, and so I joined the Air Force. That's how career decisions are made.
And how long before you made this decision was there till you went to boot camp?
I think I signed the paperwork in June of '91, which is the year I graduated, and then I left in November, so it was just a couple months.
Well, what did your parents think?
My mom was really proud of me. My dad did not think I was going to make it. He said, "She can't pick up dog poop. How could she possibly be in the military?" So he did not think I was going to make it through the basic training, and it was kind of sweet because my dad's kind of a guy's guy, and the first time I ever saw him cry was when I drove away on my way to MEPS. And he waved goodbye, and he got teared up. So that was kind of neat.
So tell me about basic training. What was that like?
Basic training was fun. That might sound sick, but of course you're scared when you first get there, but you very quickly realize we're all in this together. They're yelling at all of us, so anything they come at me for is not personal. So it didn't take me long to realize the mind game that they're trying to do this for my benefit. So I didn't like being yelled at, and I'm not a physical person, so the push-ups and the running was scary and hard. But I kind of embraced it, and it became fun, and I made some good friends with some girls there that I still stay in touch with, and so it was a good experience, and it taught me a lot of discipline that I didn't have yet.
Do you remember any of your instructors, or do any of your instructors stand out to you?
No, I mean, I remember their faces. You could never forget a face that is yelling in your face several times a day, but I can't remember any. It's been 26 years, so it's been a while.
So what was the next step after basic training?
I went to become a Russian linguist, and that came about because I took the ASVAB, and the recruiter came back and said, "Your ASVAB scores are pretty good. We'd like you to take another test for another career field. There's the computer test you can take, or the language test." And I said, "Well, I don't really know much." This was in 1991. I don't really know much about either of those. And they said, "Well, the computer test is on Wednesday and the language test is on Thursday." And I said, "Well, I have work on Wednesday, so we'll take the language test." And so that's how I became a linguist, just because that was, again, what fit in the world of events. And so I went off to the Presidio of Monterey, spent 46 47 weeks there learning Russian. And then from there I went to Goodfellow Air Force Base and spent, I think, 3 months there doing technical training. And then I went to Misawa, where that was my first duty station, and I spent 3 years in Misawa doing Russian language stuff.
Let's go back to DLI.
Yeah.
Tell me about that. What was that experience like?
Oh, that was terrible. I am not a language person. I'm more of a math science person, and so language doesn't come naturally to me. And I was also not a good student. I wasn't very disciplined, and it was such hard work. And the teachers were so hard, especially the Russian teachers. They're not fun. They had the Soviet mentality, and so they didn't like me either because I didn't try real hard. And so we were butting heads the entire year, and I struggled the entire year. And I remember when I graduated and we got our scores, the Russians are paid bonuses depending on how high the students score. And I scored high enough for them to get a bonus for my part. And I remember the one instructor, Госпожа Ефремova, Госпожа is Russian for like Mrs. Госпожа Ефремova, I was going down the hall to check my scores, and I see her running, this short little old lady. She was running towards me, oh, Dianne, Dianne, and she gives me this big hug. Of course, she hated me up until that point, and it was just because I scored well enough to give her bonus. She thought I was going to fail, and so she's my most memorable teacher. It was not in a good way then, but later on in my career I went back to be an instructor, and I worked with her as a peer, and that was a really good experience.
Did you take any language classes in high school?
I took 3 years of Spanish, which, if you want to call that language, first and second year of Spanish are not very difficult. The third year of Spanish was a little challenging for me. It's not my thing. But Russian, so it helped a little bit. I'd say not much because Russian's so different than Spanish. So it was hard. Life there was hard. You're 47 weeks in tech school. You're on phases for a while. We're in phase 1, which means you have to stay in uniform as long as you're out of your room. You can't go off base. That was a month, and there were people that didn't even have tech school for a month. So friends of mine were out, living the real Air Force, and I was still in phase 1 or phase 2. So it was pretty difficult living in the barracks. They were very old barracks. We had, if I wanted to call home, this was before cell phones, 1992. So there was a payphone in the dorm rooms in the stairwell. So, 50, 75 women had to share a payphone. And so that's how you made calls home whenever you could. And no computers, or I know you don't understand what that means, but it was not very easy to call home.
So after that, you said you went on to Goodfellow.
Yep, I went on to Goodfellow, spent 3 months there. That was a little more fun. They were more relaxed. They treated us as prior service, not as tech school students, so we didn't have the restrictions. And it was hard, but it was fun, and I felt like they prepared me as best you could for what I was going to do in my job later on.
And then you said you went to Misawa?
Yep, went to Misawa, Japan for 3 years, and I worked, I was a Russian linguist there doing stuff over there. Of course, this was 93 to 96, so the wall had fallen, Soviet Union breaking up. It was a friendly Russia, and so there was not a lot of exciting work there for me to be doing. It was kind of a quiet, boring time, but I took the opportunity to take some college courses and work on trying to get a bachelor's degree. Didn't get it there, but I worked on it.
And up until this point, how have you adapted to military life?
I think I did well. When I got to Misawa, I was still kind of stubborn and obstinate. Not that I'm not now, but in a way where I didn't really put the Air Force first. I wasn't mature, but at Misawa, something just clicked in me that, you know what, when you give your best to something, you're blessed in return, whether it's, awards, but more or less you just feel good about what you do. And up until that point, I was just kind of living to have fun. And that was a turning point in my career where I saw that if I really try to do a good job at work, there are benefits to that, work benefits and the mission benefits. And I just feel good about being able to hold my head and say, you know what, I'm doing a good job. So that was kind of a mental turning point for me.
Did you do anything fun while you were out there?
I went skiing a couple times. That wasn't fun though, because it was bad. I crashed and put a hole through my lip, and so I didn't do that. I did not take advantage like I should have. There were a lot of things to do in Japan, and I didn't take advantage of those. So unfortunately, I have to say not much. Yeah.
So after Misawa, what was the next move?
After Misawa, I went back to the Presidio, and again, my career is made because of weird choices and how things come about. I was not strategic in my life plan. Coming back from Misawa, everybody said you're either going to go to Fort Meade, Maryland, or Texas, and I didn't want to go to either of those places. So I applied for a special duty assignment to be an instructor at the Presidio of Monterey, which was kind of ironic because I hated Monterey and I hated the language. I was good at my job, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're good at the language. And so, but I didn't want to go to the other two places. So I applied, and they accepted me. So I went to the Presidio, and there I stood up I think they still have a version of it. You have the 47-week course, the formal course, but then you have a program before. We called it Head Start, where it's like a 2 or 3 week prep course for people to kind of get acclimated to, hey, the language looks different, and here's some grammar rules before you get in the course, because the dropout rate was so high, and the Air Force was trying to stop that. So I was lead for the Russian portion. I built the Russian curriculum. It was probably like a 1.0, and they're probably on 9 or 10 by this point. But that was fun because I got to work with students before they even entered the language courses formally. But then after a year of that, I became a no-kidding instructor, and I worked with Gospoja Efremova again, and it was a much better time that time, and they really helped me because I still had to struggle with my language, but this time I had to teach it, so I was very concerned to make sure I got it right, and so I'd work really hard to make my Russian better, and the instructors, they were all native. There would be 6 native speakers, 6 Russians, and then 1 military person. So I worked with the natives, and they helped my Russian and helped me understand why things were culturally, and that was a great experience. So,
this time being an instructor, was there any students that stood out to you?
Yeah, there was several. One positive, she was a Marine Corps major, and she was like, this was my first experience with a female Marine, which I guess they don't call them female Marines anymore, but they did at the time. She scared me. She was about 4'7" and like 60 pounds, super tiny. Oh, but she was just like, she was scary. She scared everybody. She was really nice, and she had a really thick Southern drawl, and she was just such a hard worker, and she was older, and it's harder to learn languages typically when you're older, and so she was really struggling, but she was so dedicated in her learning, and she was the class leader, so anytime there were student problems, she'd have to talk to me about it, and I was the liaison there. She came in one day. There was an airman there who had her hair in 2 buns off to the side, which I had never seen until that point in uniform. And she came in and told me that she's like, Sergeant Spencer, you got this airman with 2 little pigtails growing out the side of her head, and we got to do something about that. And it was just really awkward, but I couldn't keep a straight face. So here's this NCO laughing kind of at this Marine Corps major who I was scared to death of. But she was really good people, and she made life interesting.
So how long were you at that assignment?
I was there 3.5 years, I think. Okay. And then during that time, I worked to get my bachelor's degree. My commander gave me 10-month, we call it bootstrap, where you can go full-time as a student, which was such a godsend program. So for 10 months, I was still in E5, getting E5 paid, but I was a full-time student, and that's what I needed to finish my bachelor's degree. So I did that, and then I applied for a commission and got my commission while I was there, and then I headed from there off to officer training school.
All right, so tell me how officer training school was.
It was horrible. Basic training was nothing. Officer training school, I don't know what I think I was expecting a gentleman's course. Like, they're officers, they're gonna treat you with more respect, and it was exactly the opposite. I was dropping to do push-ups and sit-ups, which I'm not good at, probably every 5 to 10 minutes all day long. I probably did 400 push-ups and sit-ups the first day and could barely move. They're screaming in your face, making you scream back. I lost my voice. I lost a lot of weight. the first couple of weeks, just because you had 3 minutes to eat and they're screaming in your face the whole time, and so it was a lot more intense than I thought. Of course, anybody who's listening to this that went through the Army or Marine Corps, they're gonna laugh. But compared to enlisted, it was rough, but it was hard. You could never get everything done that they wanted you to get done, and I was struggling because I don't like to not get things done, and I was really stressing over that. And then an upperclassman said, "You're not going to get everything done. They want to see how you prioritize." And when he told me that, it was kind of like just the light went on, and I'm like, all right, that's what it is. I got to prioritize. So I still tried, but then I was a little more accepting of those things that I couldn't do or that I couldn't do well. If they were the lower priorities, I could still go to sleep at night. So, but it was a good experience.
Was there any instructors there that stood out to you?
No, I just remember thinking the enlisted, because you had the MTLs there. MTIs there, but the enlisted didn't yell at us. The officers yelled at us. The enlisted provided instruction. This is how we are going to teach you how to fold your clothes. This is how we're going to teach you drill and ceremony. But they didn't blow up at you. And I just remember thinking, it was very different from when you're enlisted and they're yelling at you. But I remember thinking that they're in a predicament, training officers to be, but they handled themselves really professionally with us and never yelled or condescended to us, but they were still very stern with us. So I have a lot of respect for them. That had to have been tough, but they did a great job.
And how long was that course?
It was 12 weeks at the time. I don't know what it is now.
So what was the first move as an officer?
From there, I went to Bowling Air Force Base, and that was not a typical lieutenant assignment. It was to a unit that worked money issues for Air Force intel programs. It was very not first lieutenant intel officer, because I went to become intel. But that's where I went, and so I made the best of it. And I was there that was 99. I was there for about a year, and then our organization deactivated, and they were trying to figure out where everybody went, and I had to stay local because I hadn't been there long enough to PCS. And so somebody recommended that I be on the Chief of Staff of the Air Force briefing team, which was kind of weird because when I was going through Airman Leadership School as an airman, I about threw up the night before I had to give my first speech, and I hate talking in front of people. Still don't like talking in front of people, but I gave my speech. It had to be 3 to 5 minutes, and I did it in 2 minutes and failed because I was so nervous. And so the idea of briefing the Secretary of the Air Force, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I'm like, I can't do this. I'm going to be puking every night. But I did, and so I went over there, and so I went to the PCA did the Pentagon, and was on the Chief's briefing team where I was a daily briefer. You're a daily briefer for a week, and then you're the backup briefer, and then the next 2 weeks you work the night shifts getting ready for the briefers. So it's like a 4-week rotation. And I was there giving those briefings, and that's when September 11th happened. And so I was stationed there on September 11th. I was on the day shift, but I was not the primary briefer. But we had a satellite location in Falls Church, and so I left the Pentagon to go meet with the analysts over in Falls Church. And while I was over there, everything got hit, and they called me back to stand up the Chief's Crisis Action Team. So I know I'm rambling on, but at that point, it was kind of an adventure trying to get me back into the Pentagon when thousands of people were leaving the Pentagon. And that was probably the biggest time in my career that I will never forget. Some of those details are like it was yesterday, and so that was pretty intense.
So did you know people personally that were in the Pentagon at the time?
I didn't. You mean where it got hit? No. It was thankfully on the mostly vacant side. It was under reconstruction, and it was the Navy side, and I didn't know anybody in that corridor, in those corridors that had gotten hit. But yeah, it was. When I finally did get back to the Pentagon several hours later, it was hard to get in because you had to have someone from the inside call out so that you could get through the gates, because it was like SWAT teams all over the gates, and the phone lines were down. So I finally got the connection to allow me into the Pentagon, and when I walked into the Pentagon, there was already smoke filling up, and I was entering in the river entrance, which is opposite of where it got hit, and coming in, there was already smoke filling up. There was blue lights going off, and a 1950s sounding recording of the perimeter has been compromised. Please evacuate. It was all kind of surreal and funny, but not, because we still weren't sure what was going on. I don't even know if at that point I knew it was a plane, because there was also reports that it was a bomb that went off. So it's all kind of weird. But we worked down in the basement, in the mezzanine, and so I went down there, and we stayed down there until, I want to say it was like 1:30 or 2 o'clock, and the smoke just got too bad. We couldn't stay there anymore, and they had been because I was on the Chief of Staff's intel team, I was the intel person for his crisis action team. Even though I had a lot of people working with me, I was kind of the face, and they were helicoptering some people over from the Pentagon to Bolling Air Force Base to stand up his CAT. And we're still down in the basement, and they just told us, okay, smoke's getting too bad, you guys need to leave. We were packing up, getting ready to leave, and they came down and they said, we need intel to head over to the CAT. So I went up to the helipad, and it was kind of the small little funny things, if you will, on that day. It was kind of funny because there were a bunch of 2- and 3-star generals waiting to get on the helicopter to go over. And then these people are like shuffling me ahead of them because I was intel, and the chief needed his intel. So I kind of got in front of all of these stars to get on the helicopter, and it was awkward and funny. So I went over there and stood up the CAT. Communication, connectivity was kind of difficult because it was a building we weren't really prepared to be in. They had one phone for hundreds of people. So that whole day was kind of interesting, trying to figure that out. And I think my husband at the time tried to go pick me up over there, and they were still in gridlock. By the time he got me home, I think it was like 4 a.m., and then I didn't even go to sleep. I had to turn back around and head back to the Pentagon, which we weren't sure what the status was of the Pentagon. All I knew was that I have to try at 6 o'clock, and so yeah, that was 9/11 for me.
So how had your daily life, or the mission really that you were working on, changed at that point in time?
Oh, yeah, so we were the Chief of Staff briefer. We were giving him daily intel briefs. Can't really talk about what they were, but the things around the world. I know Israel was a hot spot. The no-fly zones, the southern no-fly zone, the northern no-fly zones, those were hot topics we were briefing all the time. But we would give him a briefing a morning. One of our briefers would, and we had 4 people on the briefing team that rotated, as I said. And then after this, we were giving them 2 briefings a day, in the morning and the evening, 7 days a week. So I think my first day off after 9/11, because it was just a Monday through Friday thing, my first day off after 9/11 was like 7 or 8 weeks after 9/11 before I had a day off. So we surged. There was a lot more people on the briefing team. A lot of message traffic coming in, a lot of reports of other things to come, and you don't know what's valid, what's not valid, so there was a lot of confusion and concern, but it was just amazing that the team handled it like professionals. I mean, yeah, this is a terrible time, we're not exactly sure what's going on, we don't know what's coming next, but it's our job, and now we step in and we do our job, and we do the analysis we can, and we try to make the best call we can. So very long hours, a lot of stuff going on, but we're in good hands. We've got good people working for us to help keep us safe.
How long, if ever, did you feel like it took before things got back to normal, or like a normal routine? Or
that's a great question. We had the 2 shifts going for months and months, and then of course we started to ramp up to get ready to go into Iraq. I was there until February of 2002, and I left, and they were still going full, but I had moved on to my next job at that point. But I would say, I don't even know, months and months, things were still on pretty high alert there.
So what was the next move for you?
So the next move, when I was a Chief of Staff briefer, one of the recipients of my briefs, there were often 40 generals in there. One of the recipients was the Vice Chief of Staff, and so he saw me briefing for months. And his aide-de-camp, who was a major lieutenant colonel, had gotten a deployment, so he called my boss and asked if I would fill in for 7 months to be his aide. And I was a first lieutenant at the time. So I was his aide for 7 months, worked his planning, for his trips. That was my big thing. Whenever he would go somewhere, I would plan his trips. Some of the office stuff that he did when he would go to Capitol Hill, I would organize that, and I would go with him to Capitol Hill. So that was a hard job.
Mm-hmm.
That was.
Do you think that being the briefer for the Chief of Staff before this helped you along with this next job, or even further on in your career?
Being the Chief of Staff briefer definitely helped me. It helped me have better discernment on when to keep my mouth shut, because when you're a first lieutenant, briefing intel to a room full of GOs, and they're having their conversations because they're talking high-level things. And that's one of the interesting things, is you get to be the fly on the wall as they're talking strategic things way beyond you. But I also learned, not by mistake, just by being smart enough, that, you know what, I know my place. I'm a lieutenant in here, so I'm going to give him what I know, and I'm going to shut up. And he doesn't care what my thoughts are about Iraq, but, you know, what's the intel say about Iraq? That kind of stuff. So that helped, and it did help me get the aide job. That's the only reason I got the aide job, was because he saw me there. So I don't know if that was a good or a bad thing, but yeah.
And do you think being prior enlisted helped you out as an officer?
It definitely did. So being a second lieutenant at the Pentagon, I mean, you don't see them because they're not there. And I mean, I would have people come up to me in the hallways, colonels come up to me in the hallway and be like, "What's a lieutenant doing at the Pentagon?" But because I had 7.5 years prior enlisted, I could carry myself a little bit more, and I just had a little bit more wherewithal than most lieutenants. So yeah, it gave me an advantage, and I think because of that, it made me look better than my peers, just because it does. And so I don't want to say an unfair advantage, but it's a natural advantage when you've already been somewhere 7 years in the Air Force, and then you're put in. It's not hard to shine above those who have only done this for a year. So.
All right, so what was the next move?
So after that, my boss, the vice chief, said, "You need to go operational," and so he sent me to Korea for a year, and I was not happy with that because it was a remote one-year tour, but it was one of the best jobs of my life. I was the chief of targets at Osan, and so I spent a year there war fighting the war with North Korea, and we had exercises 4 or more times a year. We won every time, so that's good news. We always win, which is good. We have the victory party planned before the exercise is over, but that was really good. It was good operational experience working with the flying community. They fight hard and they work hard too, and so it was really good for me to see that.
Did you take advantage of any fun things to do in Korea?
Wish I could say I did. I don't think I did. In fact, I didn't go to the DMZ until I went 2 years ago on an exercise. So no, I was not a fan of the food, and I took advantage of the shopping. So I did a lot of shopping, but yeah.
And what year was this?
This was 2003. 2003, I was in Korea.
Okay, and then what was after that?
So after that, I decided I'm homesick, and my career had kind of gotten away with me. It had taken me away, you know, becoming the chief of staff briefer and the vice chief aide, and I was on the fast track, and I wasn't trying to be on the fast track, and there were all these expectations, and I was going through a divorce, and I said, this isn't my priority in life. I need to get back home to Ohio. So I applied for a HUMIT position with the Defense Intelligence Agency here at Wright-Patterson, just because I wanted to be home with my family. And a lot of people said, don't do that, that'll kill an intel officer's career, doing HUMIT, not good. And I said, I don't care, it's not about that anymore, I just need to be home and find my roots. And so I came back here. They interviewed me. I was supposed to speak Russian to them as part of the interview, and every time they would talk to me in Russian, because my Russian had atrophied, so I would just change the subject on them. And so they hired me anyway, and so I came back here and was with DIA for 2 years, 2004 to 2006, here at Wright-Patterson, doing that. And during that time is when I deployed to the United Nations into Tbilisi, Georgia.
So had you been to, I know you're originally from Ohio, but had you been to Dayton and Wright-Pat before?
I was at Wright-Pat once when I was on leave with my mom because I needed a new uniform, like blue shirt or something. And when at the Presidio of Monterey, it was an Army post. They had some Air Force things, but I'm kind of tall and not everything fits. So my mom drove me down here once, but I just remember being overwhelmed because when you see gate 36C, you're like, dang, how many gates are there and why do they have a C? So I didn't really know much about it other than it was close to home.
All right, so tell me about working with NATO at Tbilisi, Georgia.
Yeah, so with the United Nations, they had an observer mission in Georgia. The Republic of Abkhazia had broken away or tried to break away, and the United Nations stepped in the early 90s, I think. And the United Nations recognizes that Abkhazia is still part of Georgia, but they wouldn't reconcile. And so there was a demilitarized zone because they had a war there, and there was a demilitarized zone along the border. And interestingly enough, the United Nations, we were the observers there, but we were not allowed to be armed. The armed enforcement along the DMZ were the Russians, who were part of the UN and recognized it as part of Georgia, but the Russians were also the ones that were arming Abkhazia and enabling them to be the breakaway republic and doing a lot of what they do now. It's very much like what they're doing now with Crimea. And so the Russians were the armed force, and we were the UN observers to make sure everybody was abiding by that. So as the Americans, I guess an American had gotten beat up a couple years before I was there up in the DMZ, and no one, the law enforcement on both sides didn't do anything to try to find who did it. So the U.S. said, until you guys have a little bit of law enforcement up there, we're not putting our people in. So the two U.S. liaisons, we were at the Capitol in Tbilisi, which is well inside Georgia. So I was there most of the time, and my job was working with the ministers of defense and other ministers in Georgia, and also talking to the embassy, the ambassadors for all the nations. There were 23 countries involved, so I'd go give the ambassadors updates of Germany or the UK or of whatever countries wanted updates, and so I did a lot of the liaising there. And then once in a while I would get to go up and spend a couple nights up in the DMZ and go on patrols with them. And there was one, this was kind of fun. There was one time we were going, I think we were on the Georgian side, but we were patrolling, and so we heard that the Russians were doing some live fire tests, which is fine, but we'll drive by and check it out. And so they were along the coast there with the Black Sea, and we pulled up, and of course there weren't very many females in the military in our mission at the time. I may have been the only female, and I spoke Russian, which is why I was on the deployment. And so the Russians were there. It was a lieutenant colonel and his battalion, and so they saw me and they were like, oh, come talk to us. So I went, and they let me fire the Makarov pistol on their range. They let me fire the rocket propelled grenade. They let me look through the sniper scope, but they wouldn't let me touch it otherwise because their snipers are really particular apparently about their weapons. And I got to get in a BMP and fire off. I don't know how I did because it was so far away I couldn't tell. Whatever those big shells are that BMPs do, and I'm not big on Army stuff. But it was just a lot of fun. I spent several hours with them, firing their weapons, and it was really cool to have that interaction at just the normal level of military. I was a captain. I was talking to other captains and enlisted guys, and it was also interesting just to see the Russians. Some of them were in uniform, some of them weren't in uniform, some were halfway in uniform, and but just that was a really unique opportunity that not a lot of people get. Yeah.
How many days did it take your Russian to come back to you?
So at that point, that was in 2004, and I hadn't touched Russian since '99. I applied for this job thinking, I want to deploy, and with DIA it was kind of hard to deploy, but they needed a Russian speaker, and my scores were good even though my language wasn't. It didn't take long at all. When you're in country, you have no choice because the Georgians who were 20 and older spoke Georgian and Russian, and Georgian's nothing like Russian, and I don't know Georgian. The Georgians who are 20 and younger speak Georgian and English. So any of the older generation, I had to speak Russian or I was not going to communicate. It didn't take long at all. In fact, that was probably when I spoke the best in my whole career. I got a really good compliment. I was taking a taxi somewhere, probably about 4 months in. And so I was telling the taxi driver, where I wanted to go, and we chatted up conversation, and he said, he goes, "Are you from Moscow?" And I said, "No." He goes, "You have a Moscow accent." And it just made me feel good. I don't even know what that means, but it made me feel good. It wasn't like you have an American accent, so yeah.
That was one of the things, the follow-up questions I had is when you were going through the language school, was what dialect you were taught?
So apparently Moscow. I didn't know that until I got to Georgia, but yeah, apparently Moscow. Our team was comprised of different, like we had some from the Ukraine. There was actually a Polish lady. They were teaching Russian because she knew Russian, but she wasn't Russian. But most of them were from different parts of Russia. So.
How long was this deployment?
It was 7 months, so it wasn't too long. It was fun, and for a deployment, it was not bad at all. I mean, we had the 2 U.S. people. We had a house, and it's not a first world country, but it's not terrible. And the Georgian people, are so kind and so nice, and so it was pretty easy.
Now, up until this point, you've now had an experience in Georgia. You were in Korea for a year, and in Japan. Had your outlook on life or experiencing these different cultures changed at all?
Yeah, growing up in a small town, Ohio, you just don't know much at all about the world. You just don't. And when I left small town Ohio, I swore I'd never be back. I'm done. And I remember even like basic training. My school, 105 people graduating, was all white. And so I remember going to basic training, and there were a bunch of black girls. And I'm like, holy cow, I didn't even know there were this many black people in America. You're just so ignorant. And then going out and seeing the world, you don't realize the fun and cool things that other countries have. You also don't realize some of the suffering that goes on and how lucky we are and how fortunate we are. Like with the Georgians, just like seeing the dogs, like they were like stray cats, dogs everywhere, starving. And it's kind of heartbreaking. The people weren't starving. It wasn't so bad in 2004. But it really makes you appreciate. They would lose electricity all the time. Can I tell you one more story?
Yes, go ahead.
So, speaking of losing electricity, so on one of our patrols, we were up in the demilitarized zone for the UN, and we were going through, and we were coming through a town, and the UN does the same patrols all the time. They're very predictable. And we go into, they're called Nyalas, they're armored personnel carriers from South Africa. And so we go in twos, and we go into this tiny little town in the northern part of Georgia. And as we pull in, there's people in the streets, and they're like, come on, come on. And we're like, okay. So the people start moving, and we're pulling in, and then the people move out of the way, and there's cement barriers in the road. And we're like, oh, that's not good. So we go to pull out, and a semi-truck pulls in behind us and blocks us in. And we're like, this is weird, because the Georgians are so nice. And so we get out, and here they decided they were going to hold us captive until we give them electricity back. Well, the UN has nothing to do with their electricity. That's a Georgian government thing. So long day short, we spent 3 hours there. I was held hostage by the Georgians, the friendliest people you could possibly be held hostage by, while we called our headquarters, and then they called the Georgian government, who then called the local government and tried to work out, look, these guys can do nothing to help you get your electricity. But they would go months and it was the winter time, and they would go months without electricity, and they were desperate, and they just wanted somebody to pay them attention. And so it was funny because in such the Georgian way, they're such good hosts, and they will give you, the shirt off their backs and all the food and drink you could possibly imagine. So while we're sitting there waiting, they're like bringing us hot meat and wonderful bread and wine and chashki, which is a little Georgian type drink. And they were great hosts for our captivity. So it was the best hostage situation you could possibly imagine. So. Yeah, and then the TV was there. So when I got back that night, the landlord of my apartment, she comes running up to me, and she's like, "Oh, Deanna, I saw you on TV. Are you okay? Did they treat you okay?" And so it was a big deal in Georgia for that to happen. But I survived.
All right, so after this deployment, you went back to Wright Pat?
Yep, I went back to DIA, and that's when I met my husband, and we've been married 11 years now. And at the time, we started dating, and for officers, you stay 2 years, and then you PCS. And my husband had 2 daughters that the divorce decree said that they had to stay in that school district. And so it was a decision of, do I PCS away or do I get out? And I was almost at 15 years active, and it was an easy decision. I'm getting out because this is more important. And so many people advised me, don't do that. You've only got 5 years. You can go away for 5 years. You guys can make it. And that was not even an option for me. So that's why and how I went into the reserves. So in 2006, I transferred into the reserves. Became what we call an individual mobilization augmentee. So I did that for 8 years, various jobs at the National Air and Space Intelligence Center, working HUMINT still. That I spent 6 years standing up the HUMINT effort, mostly with reservists and contractors. I was the first commander of the HUMINT detachment, which is now a squadron at NASIC. So that was kind of neat to see that grow from just a couple of us doing work to it's now a squadron of 70 plus people. So yeah, I did that for a while.
And these jobs that you had, these were as a reservist or is these civilian employment?
They were as a reservist. So my hope was when I got out at 14 and a half years, I really wanted to get an active duty retirement if I could, which would require me to be on extended orders. But I also knew that might not happen. And that was my decision and I was good with it. But God is good. And so for the next 3 years, I was on orders to stand up the HUMINT program. So I got 3 more years there right away. And then at that point, man days dried up, and that's when I became I applied and became a civilian at NASIC. And so then for several years, I was a civilian, and then I'd take a couple months and work man days, just trying to chip away at that 20-year active time.
So tell us what HUMINT is, and what does a HUMINT unit do?
Oh, that's a great question. So HUMINT is human intelligence, and I'll just give you the standard unclassified book answer, which is when you gain intelligence through interaction between two people. So instead of, say, signals intelligence, which could be monitoring a phone call, if you're the bad guy and you're talking to another bad guy and I intercept your phone call, that's signals intelligence. But if I talk to you and you tell me the same information, that's human intelligence, where I'm talking to individuals.
All right, so I think we're getting to the point where I'd like to talk about is the 14th Intelligence Squadron.
Yeah.
So you came to a point where you stood up the squadron, the 14th. So tell me about that experience.
Yeah, so I was again I was about at 18, a little over 18 years active service, and I wanted my 20 years. At that point, I didn't think I was going to get it, and that my body wasn't going to be able to do PT tests forever. So I was starting to get worried, and then I had done some man days for the 655th ISR group commander at the time, Doug Drakely, and I did some months for him, just helping him stand up the HUMINT squadron there, the reserve HUMINT squadron, and he called me one day and said, "Hey, we're standing up this other squadron. Are you interested?" And I said, I don't know, because it wasn't active time at that point. And I said, I don't know. I've committed to a new job here at NASIC. And then somehow, by a miracle, the billet, the commander billet for the 14th, instead of becoming the status of civilian, became the status of military, which if I took it, then that is my 20 years. If I take the 3-year tour, which it was, that would put me over 20. So it was a military billet. It's kind of complicated. But so he calls me again and says, so this billet status has changed. Are you interested now? And I was like, so you're telling me not only can I go on active duty for 3 years and get my retirement, but you're telling me I can do it in a command position? Yeah, absolutely, I want it. And I had to apply and be interviewed. But so I did that, and it was before the unit stood up, so there was just a handful of us that were there at the very beginning, 5 or 6 of us, that when the unit activated, we were there, and so we stood it up. It was kind of acquisition intelligence. What is that? I didn't know. In 22 years, I had no idea what that mission set was all about. And luckily I had a director of operations, Ben Smallwood, who knew acquisitions very well, and so we worked well together. I worked more of the standing up the unit structurally and the manpower and everything, trying to get us sorted as a unit, and he worked trying to figure this mission set out that we weren't used to doing. It was really incredible. That 3 years of my time, I just am amazed. I worked with great people for the last 25 years, but I was just amazed at the caliber, and I'm not saying that just because you're one of them. The caliber of the airmen in that squadron was just amazing. You had airmen first class, E3s, that were so mature and so dedicated, but fun, and they could joke and banter, but they were so dedicated to the work. And these guys have other lives. They're either going to school or they've got family and work and a lot of things going on, and to carve out time, 1 week in a month and come so dedicated. I would so look forward to drill weekends, because Monday through Friday I'm there and the active duty guys are there, and that's fine. But then Saturday morning would just be like this buzz of excitement. There was just this electricity, and it was just, it kind of puts the full-timers on a high to have everybody come in that you haven't seen in a month and just hit the ground running, and such creative ideas. You guys came up with all kinds of new things and ways to do this new mission set that we would never have imagined we would have gotten to. And so it was really a blessing for me to be with such great people and to just learn a lot about professionalism and kindness to each other and being good wingmen. Even though you only see each other once a month, if someone had a problem, you guys were there for each other. And it was just really, it was an awesome experience.
Can you explain acquisition intel?
I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can. I will try. I should, huh? So in the Air Force, in any organization, but in the government, you have an acquisition community. These are the folks that are trying to develop the new systems for the future. So, for example, we're working on long-range strike bomb, the next generation. What's that going to look like? The B-52 cannot fly forever. What's the next generation going to look like? And that takes decades to do. So looking at the F-22, the F-35, those were started decades ago. And so the acquisition community is the one that goes 20, 30 years ago and says, you know what, we're going to need something beyond the F-16 and the F-15. So we're going to start planning now for that. And what does that look like? What does the system need to be capable of? Well, from an intel perspective, I can tell you it needs to be better than the adversary system. Well, what's the adversary system going to look like in 20 or 30 years? That's hard to say. We don't even know what our systems are going to look like. So what Intel tries to do, Acquisition Intel tries to do, is what we do is we work with these folks that are developing the future systems to try to understand their requirements. Oh, I need to fly this height, at this altitude, this fast, it needs to carry this many munitions, but also advise them. So we think that the enemy is probably going to have this capability in 20 years based on other intel community sources looking long range. And so, hey, have you thought about, protection from this type of threat? Not just missiles, but there are other threats other than missiles or cyber threats. And so looking at various types of cyber threats, hey, have you thought about that? So that they don't get 15 years into the planning cycle just to see, you know what, we never did anything to defend against cyber threats. If we do that now, we're adding billions of dollars because we have to change a major function. So getting there earlier and advising them earlier helps with all along the way to save costs, to prevent it from being overrun on time, and ideally to just defeat the adversary when we get to that 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
Do you share across branches of service?
Share which
your acquisition intelligence?
We do. There are a lot of joint working groups that work. Like the F-35 is very joint, and so there's a lot of joint interaction for electronic warfare. There are joint working groups. In fact, our squadron had one of our guys that was the head of that working group for a while for the whole DoD. That joint working group that they work together and coordinate. So we do share challenges, lessons learned, and intel information.
So what was the learning curve like having an extensive intel career in human and in linguistics, now introducing acquisitions? Was it hard to get used to how to interpret acquisitions in an intelligence way?
It was for me. It was very difficult for me, and that's why I am very thankful for Lieutenant Colonel Smallwood. It was so foreign from any other intel work I had done before, and I really, as a commander, you go into the natural tendency to feel like everybody's looking to me for the answers, and you want You want to be able to solve all the problems. But that was a great lesson on no, you need to facilitate and let the smart people do that. And so I didn't know. There were times I'd be like, I have no idea what we can do on a drill weekend that could help this mission set. And so, and even Colonel Smallwood, who was really savvy on AC Intel, he had some ideas, but it was the airmen, once they got there and started learning what acquisition does, to go, well, you know what, I think we could do this on a drill weekend, because it's something you touch once a month and then you go away for a month and then you come back. So what can you really do to affect change and further the mission? And it was the airmen that came up with amazing solutions and answers that gave us options that really showed we did some great mission work and furthered the mission, helped a lot of customers out.
Mm-hmm. What's different about being a commander, standing up a squadron versus just being a commander with a squadron that's existed before?
Well, that's a good question. I was a acting commander. I was a deck commander for the HUMINT. We weren't that big, maybe 40 people. And then I was a acting commander for 6 months for 100 people. When you're a commander of a unit that already exists, you hopefully already see the problems. If your predecessor doesn't tell you about them, and a lot of times they don't because they look at it from their lens and they think everything's going fine, but usually your boss will, the group commander will say, you need to fix this, this, and this. So you're kind of told it's on the tracks already, the train is going down the road, but there might be some challenges that you have to tweak. Standing up a new squadron, you're not even sure where the tracks are. The tracks might not be built. And so trying to figure out how to build the tracks to get it going, and I'm one that goes very much in sequential order. So I wanted to build the unit, get the space taken care of, bring the people in, provide some training, and then move down the road slowly, because I didn't know what was going to happen with the mission set, and that was not an option. My boss said, you know what, you guys have been active for 3 months, you need to start producing intel. And I'm like, we're not, I mean, we're 23% manned. How are we supposed to be doing it? And he's like, I don't care. You need to start showing your worth already. And so there was that pressure from above to show mission impact when you're still standing up. And that was hard, but the airmen did it. They miraculously somehow pulled that out.
What would you say is the most important thing in standing up a squadron?
I think you gotta get the right people. And my chief Master Sergeant Howerton, did a great job recruiting the enlisted folks. They need to be smart, they need to be self-starters, because if they just want to follow orders and the orders don't exist yet, then you're not going to go anywhere. So getting the right folks, and I think part of the challenge also was trying to keep them motivated, because there were so many unknowns. And when you're at any level, when you don't think something's clear, you're like, you know, they don't know what they're doing. She's confused. She's stupid, and it's really because there's so much ambiguity that you don't know at your level. So trying to keep them motivated to just say, yeah, well, you know, I know it seems confusing right now, but you know, we've got somewhere we're going, and just stick through it. I know it's tough now doing all this admin stuff, but stick through it. We got to get through it. So trying to keep them motivated so they don't get discouraged with all of the minutia, and they want to have mission impact today, and we're not quite ready for that. That was a challenge.
Mm-hmm. So one of the last things you did in your career was dig into the history of the 14th, and you found, well, originally one World War II vet, then which led to another one.
Yeah.
So what was, explain to me what led to that, what was the importance of that, and just that entire experience of finding these two World War II vets that had history with the 14th Intelligence Squadron, and then sharing their history.
So that, oddly enough, it's not mission related at all, but that's like the one thing that that's probably the thing I'm happiest about is, so we stood up in 2014, and we were given a lineage by the Air Force Office of Heraldry, and it said that we had this squadron from the 9th Phototech Squadron from World War II. And I was like, okay, well, wouldn't it be nice to just kind of say this is what we were? And it really didn't give any information. And when I was associated with the flying squadrons in Korea, they would, like once a month when they would meet at a night and do their naming parties and stuff, one of the new guys, a lieutenant, would have to stand up and give some little factoid about the history of that squadron, you know, back when, during the Korean War, blah, blah, blah. And it was just really neat that they pulled their history into their current day and celebrated it. And I thought, I want something. And so I put lots of searches into Library of Congress, the Historical Research Agency, and all kinds of places, and came back with nothing more than just these were the dates and locations they were, nothing more. And so I would Google it, and I didn't get anything. And then in 2016, we were about to hit our 2-year anniversary, and I'm Googling and Googling, and I just used the name of the unit was the 9th Photographic Technical Squadron, and I used every possible combination except the 9th Photo Tech Squadron. I didn't abbreviate those 2 words together. And so I was just doing a search one day, and sure enough, this thing popped up. It was a news article from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette from 1995 about a veteran who had these massive pictures of the atomic bombings that he processed, and that was his mission. This was an article from 95, so I had no idea where this was going to go. So I called the Post-Gazette, who led me to the Legion, who led me to, it was a long trail, and then I find this guy, Jerry Johnson, and I leave a voicemail on his phone saying, I don't know if this is the right Jerry Johnson, but if you're from World War II, and I didn't say, and if you're still around, can you call me back? And 10:30 that night, I get this phone call from this really sweet-sounding older gentleman. This is Jerry. Well, it was Jerry Johnson. And so we talked for like an hour, and he's still around. And so I said, you know, I want to come out and visit you. I want to interview you, kind of like this. Can I come visit? He's like, yeah. He goes, and I got a bunch of old photos and things that I kept. He collects everything, and he had a lot of original photos from their unit. So their unit was stationed at Guam and processed the film from the B-29s, including the boxcar and the Enola Gay. So they would fly out, do photograph, whether it was just a reconnaissance mission or on the atomic bombings, the photographs of those missions, bring them back, and then the 9th would process that. And so Jerry had a lot of the footage that he had processed and had those original copies. And so I went out and met with Jerry, kind of debriefed him, and then another person in our squadron, Master Sergeant Jeanette Cook, she did another Google search and found the second veteran that we know of, Milt Denis, and found him. And so we were already planning on Jerry coming out in September of 2016 to the base and kind of doing an honors thing for him. And so we added Milt to it as well. And the whole base was great about these guys. They're 92, 93-year-old veterans, and NASIC provided them an unclassified mission briefing, which they thought was the most awesome thing. NASIC has the Open Skies mission, which does the verification treaties with Russia, and they have a film processing center there. So they gave them a tour of that, which was kind of funny because the processing equipment they have is Vietnam era. It's very antiquated. And so Jerry and Milt were going through, and Jerry was like, this stuff is so high tech, this is amazing. And it was just funny because our guys are like, this is so old. But he just thought that was the coolest thing. And then we hosted him at our squadron. The museum gave him a tour of the museum. We had our pictures taken in front of the boxcar with their images. Jerry made a great donation to the museum of these images that the museum now owns. And I still talk with them. I talked with Jerry about 3 weeks ago, and it was just heartwarming because I had no idea that information was out there. But more importantly, especially Jerry, he is at a point in life where he's kind of like, you know, what's it all about? What legacy did I leave? He didn't have, he never got married, never had kids. And so this really meant the world to him. And I think it made the end of his life special, and he's still alive, so there's still room for other special things. But I think it was just really significant to honor them and for him to feel honored because he never had been before. Mm-hmm. So that was amazing, and I hope you guys are still carrying on the history. Mm-hmm. Okay,
we are.
Okay.
So the 14th Intelligence Squadron was your last assignment.
Yeah.
What led to the decision to retire?
Oh, that was so hard. It was so hard. So I was a civilian at NASIC, and very graciously agreed to give me 3 years, which they had to legally, but they said, yep, you want to go on that 3-year military tour, go ahead, we'll have a job for you when you get back. And it was fabulous that they did that. And so when my 3-year tour was up, I had to either go back to traditional status, so I would still do weekend drills and my civilian job. That was probably the hardest decision I've made in my career, because I did not feel like I was ready to take the uniform off. At that point, I felt like I still had more to give, and I wanted to help the next generations, because I felt like I was finally starting to figure some of it out, and I want to help those that are trying to figure it out. And but I'm not going to lie, my husband was pressuring me retire. He saw the money aspect, which I got my active duty retirement, which means I collect the retirement right away if I retire. If I don't retire, I don't collect the money, and I work one weekend a month. And so there was a big financial disparity between the two options, and my husband wanted more time with me. And so I decided to retire, and that was the hardest decision I've ever made. But you know, I about 3 or 4 months in, I felt like, yeah, that was the right decision, and maybe I could have given more. But it's also time now, you know, when you have aging parents and your parents are not doing well, you need to have time with them. And when you have 2 jobs, that's hard to do. And so I'm thankful now of where I am in life, because I have more time to give family that needs it.
Mm-hmm. Reflecting back on your career, what was probably your proudest moment?
I guess it would be with Jerry and Milt. And granted, that's fresh compared to some older things, but it's not mission related. But we made those guys, we made their lives. They felt so special and so honored. We rolled out the red carpet for them that had never been done for them, as far as for Jerry, anything. And Milt was, I think, accomplished in his own right, as was Jerry. But for their military time, no one honored them for that. And we really did it right. And so just knowing that they feel good and they know that the country they served appreciates them, I think that's got to be it. Mm-hmm. By a landslide, I can't even think of anything close to that.
Mm-hmm. What was probably the most difficult moment?
Well, I'm pretty sure the most difficult moment was working for the Vice Chief of Staff that I did. I did not find him to have good ethics and morals, and I lost a lot of sleep over decisions and things he did, because I'm in the inner circle and I see how he makes decisions and the things he does, and I had a real challenge with that. I was a first lieutenant, he was a 4-star general. So if I were to tell someone, hey, I think he's wasting and abusing government resources here in this way, I really struggle with that. I don't know what the right answer would have been. They say the right answer is to report it, but I don't know that it would have done any good. But he was not a nice person. He was not a nice man, and he treated me well, but the way he treated so many other organizations and people that were just trying to serve him, it was really hard to see. And that was one of those things, those bad leaders that you learn from. He was one of those, but my time for him was pretty miserable.
Mm-hmm. What message do you have for future generations that might be viewing this interview?
I guess my message is, if you're not sure, so if future generations, if they're not military, if you're not sure you want to join the military, maybe it's not right for you, but dang, you grow up, you learn discipline, the camaraderie, being in the military is special. It's like nothing else you can really compare it to. So it was an amazing experience. I loved it. 25 years I thought it was okay. But also, if you know what's right for your life, don't let others try to steer you this way or that way. You need to do this for your career. You need to do that for your career. You need to do what's right for you. And so it'll work out. Like for me, I had so many people say, nobody throws away a 15-year active duty career. You're never going to get your retirement. Just suck it up for 5 years. And I knew it wasn't right, and I did what was right for me, and it still worked out. I got my 22 years active in 25 years, and I loved it. So you got to do what's right for you. Be true to yourself. I know it sounds kind of cheesy and oversaid, but if you're true to yourself, it'll work out. Whatever it is meant to be, it'll work out. So I'm just blessed. I can't believe it's been 25 years. I feel so old when I say it that way, but it flew by, and it was a great experience. I loved it.
Eric, do you have any more questions?
You mentioned Airman Leadership School. Did you also have any NCO schools that you went to?
No, I went through Airman Leadership School, and then I made staff my first time up, which at the time was hard. It's not so much anymore. And then from there, I got selected for Officer Training School. So I did SOS, Squadron Officer School, Air Command and Staff College, Air War College, but I didn't do any more enlisted development.
Did your time as an enlisted person help you being an officer dealing with enlisted?
I think it did. Everybody has their own view of how they are, but for me, things like when people come into my office when I was a commander, it was really hard for me to walk in a room and have everybody stand up, and I had to get used to it because that's the right way to do it, but I was very uncomfortable at first with that kind of protocol. But like when they would come into my office to take out trash, I would be really bothered if they would go grab my trash. I would try to beat them to it, so I would grab my trash first. If I saw people doing physical work and I was around and available, I would do that too, because why not pitch in if we can get it done faster? Little things like that, that just when I was enlisted and I would see officers that seemed so aloof, that really put me off. And so I just tried to think, well, we're all one team, and I'm no better than they are. So hopefully that was clear. But yeah, I don't know. You'll have to ask the people that worked for me.
When you were in Korea and you mentioned the naming ceremony, were you given a call sign?
I was. It was a long time ago. I was. My call sign was Shasta, and I'll just leave it at that. It was a good group of folks.
That's about it for me.
Well, that's all I have. Okay. Dianne, thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate what you guys do.
And thank you for your service. And a big thanks to you personally, because you're the reason I'm sitting in this seat here, doing the interview with Jerry and Milt. That kind of led to this, and this is something that I love. So you're a great commander. I really appreciate it. And then, yeah, thanks for all you've done. So
thanks. You guys are great. I love what you do here, so thank you.
All right, well, that concludes the interview of Dianne Hickey.
Okay, thanks.